I've had paranoia. I thought people were following me or that people were out to get me. Delusions. I've been convinced that the mafia were after me or that ASIO had bugged my phone. I've had ideas of reference where I thought the TV or the radio had special messages for me. I've had visual hallucinations. I see flashes of light, and I've heard voices as well. When I'm sick, I can't distinguish between my voice, my own thoughts, and the voices.
I got diagnosed when I was 21. That was when I had my first psychotic episode and I was taken to hospital. I'd been taking drugs, not just prior to the episode, but, you know, I had been experimenting with drugs and stuff. That was the first time I was given a diagnosis and, you know, told I had a mental illness and put on medication.
Some people have diabetes or some people have deafness. My illness is a mental illness. I think some people have this idea that, you know, the brain needs to be perfect because it's where I am. You know, it's where I live. And if that gets disturbed, then I've been, you know, obliterated, or I've been damaged. The essence of me. And it's not true.
I got sick, first of all, when I was 17, which is a long time ago now. 4 weeks ago I was sick again with another episode that lasted about a month. So it's a lifelong learning for me. I've never been well longer than 10 months. For me, life has always been about trying to learn how to live with the illness.
Schizophrenia, the popular concept at the moment is someone who experiences things that aren't there, like hears voices that aren't outside but they hear them in the head anyway, or sees things that aren't actually there. So the mind creates a false image of the external world. Because we're so used to the mind giving us a real image, it's very hard to recognise when those things are not real. But the more fundamental thing that we're now becoming aware of is it's a disorganisation of thinking. People can experience difficulties in focusing their thoughts, in remembering what's happening, in planning, in dealing with complexity. If things get too complex, they start to feel overwhelmed by the complexity, but can function okay when things are happening in an ordered way. Those are often problems that start up before people actually start to experience the other problems with voices. We often see what we call a prodrome, where people find more difficulty relating to their family, their work, their environment, withdrawing, and then that goes on, and they're having increasing difficulty, getting more isolated.
I was really extroverted and very loud at school and did all the public speaking competitions and things, and then I became quite detached from a lot of my school friends and became a bit introverted and quiet, and I felt really isolated and I couldn't talk to anyone about it.
What then happens is that people can experience the first of the psychosis, which is the experiencing voices talking or feeling people are threatening, heightened sensitivity, heightened sense of threat. That's the scary part, and that's when it usually declares itself, and it's obviously there's a problem.
I think one of the biggest struggles for a lot of people is one, accepting that they've got the illness, then accepting that they may need some medication, and most people do. And then the long process, which is a long process for most people, of actually figuring out how the medications are going to work, which one's best for them. And I guess the need to experiment with your doctor's support to find the best medication for you.
I think ideally, at some stage for your illness, you're going to need a good psychiatrist or a good doctor who can give you sound advice on medication and how it affects you, and in the early stage is really important to get the right kind of medication, because there is now a range of medications, and what may not work for some people might work for you. Get good advice about the dosage that you need, because it can vary so much from individual to individual. It's very important to know what side effects are happening and to get help with any side effect, and if it's becoming too uncomfortable or you can't live with it, to change medications. I think a lot of people go off their medication because they're getting side effects, but they don't talk about it, and then they get their symptoms back. Because even if you come off your medication, you should do it in stages. If you go too quickly, it can really play havoc.
I was on a couple of dreadful things at first that gave me side effects that I didn't realise were side effects. And I think that's one thing I could get angry about, is that no one sat me down at the time and spoke to me and said, you could be getting these side effects.
When I first started on medication, I started on a medication which eventually started giving me sort of jerky movements, like my arm would just go like that sort of thing. I told my psychiatrist about the jerky movements, and he put me onto another medication which unfortunately didn't control the illness as much as the first medication had. Then we tried a different medication, and I've been on that medication ever since then, and it's one of the latest medicines and things. But, it's really important to talk to your doctor when you know that the medicine isn't working, or when it's giving you side effects that are either dangerous, or because there are some side effects which can be dangerous. So it's really important when you're having symptoms that you can't manage that you talk to your psychiatrist about it. And I talked to my psychiatrist about it, and I think, for that reason, among millions of other reasons, I think that I tend to need a psychiatrist I can trust, and I can trust my psychiatrist, and I trust him absolutely, and he doesn't do anything in my treatment without asking me first, without consulting me first, and so I feel I'm involved in my recovery, in my treatment.
The medication that I'm on now, generally, I see it as a kind of a designer drug, really, that enhances my performance. Whereas some of the older ones that I was on really did flatten out my emotions, and I think they can play havoc with your libido and stuff like that sometimes, and they can, certainly they put on weight, which is one of the worst things for me. But it's a kind of a trade-off, because you want to have this clearer mind.
All antipsychotic drugs do control the major positive symptoms of schizophrenia. However, because of the inevitable side effects that go with most drugs, people have a lot of difficulty taking them, and there's a strong resistance. I believe it's important as a clinician to work out what is the optimal dose, which is the minimum dose that will control positive symptoms adequately without causing unnecessary side effects. The next question is, for how long do I have to take it? And we haven't got any clear guidelines to that yet. However, it does seem that there are risks with stopping medication even after 12 months of being functioning well and symptom-free, perhaps back at work. The relapse rate is still unacceptably high. There is also a risk of the relapse will cause further psychological and emotional damage, and there's some evidence now emerging that people don't respond as well to medication the second time round. If people are doing well on medication, if we found an optimal dose, it's a good idea to stay on it for a longer period of time. There will be some people who will need to take medication for life, and that is something that people have to prepare themselves for, that there is that possibility.
Last year I tried to go off one of my medications twice. I tried to go off it, and within 5 days I was sort of getting anxiety and going woo. I don't think medication is the only answer. I think it's one aspect. Going back to that question of taking medication, it was like when I was younger to accept, right, okay, I have a mental illness, so I stay on my medication. and I accepted that, but that didn't make life perfect, you know. It didn't, you know, there was all these other aspects, all these other things I had to do.
Often people talk about the stages they go through in accepting they've got an illness like schizophrenia. You know, there's denial, there's anger, there's a gradual acceptance, there's a way through that journey to acceptance that you have an illness like schizophrenia. People really need help with that process, I think. Ideally, although it's very rare that people do get it, they need or they benefit from the advice of a good psychologist or a good counsellor, because I think part of what my wellness is in working through the emotions that I have associated with the illness, and trying to understand my life better so that I don't have as many hassles with life that can trigger stress. I think particularly at certain stages of recovery, that stuff I was talking about with the grief, that, you know, I've got this illness, my life's over kind of stuff, to work those through is really important. And in its extreme phases, I mean, like, in reality, nearly everybody that I know that's had schizophrenia at some stage has thought about suicide. And a lot of them never had the chance to talk about that, and probably a lot of the ones that I know that have killed themselves never had the chance to work that through. And the reality is that some 15% of people with schizophrenia will commit suicide within the first 5 years of their diagnosis. My feeling is that a lot of those deaths are avoidable, you know, because it's often internalisation of stigma and stuff rather than people acting out some delusional thought. People need to talk about that, you know, they need to talk about their feelings of worthlessness or their feelings of despair about having the illness in the early stages, and work it through in some positive way. When I was younger, I would just go into psychosis. It would be a gradual process, but I wouldn't really recognise what was happening, and eventually I'd be psychotic and I'd be so inappropriate other people would respond to me and say, oh, you better take medication. And whereas as I've gotten older, I actually feel the changes myself, and usually I pick the fact that my thinking's becoming strange and try and do something about it. Some people talk about a signature pattern, which is actually like recognising certain signs in your thinking or certain behaviours that you do when you're starting to get unwell. And if you see them coming on, well, then you start to do something to prevent it. A lot of people with schizophrenia that I know actually ask their friends to help them monitor their condition. You know, very often the people closest to you will pick up signs that you're becoming unwell, perhaps even before you do.
Good morning, Peter Sharkin speaking. Hi. Okay. Even though I was on the verge of becoming unwell, in the early stages I might recognise it, but once I started getting symptoms I may not recognise it, and I might need the help of a friend to get help from the mental health service. I've developed my own early intervention plan, and that details what are the early indicators of stress, what are my early warning signs, what action I should take. For example, if I was becoming unwell, I might, for example, try and take some time off work. I would ring up the crisis team and ask to speak to someone there and get to see a doctor and ask to put my medication up, things like that. I might change my environment. I could go away for a few days, cancel appointments. I've given a copy of my early intervention plan to my best friend. Basically, I rely on her to tell me if I've got any of the symptoms, if I'm unable to do it myself. She'll know if I sound different over the telephone or when we meet up, or if I'm scared about anything or paranoid about anything. She'll pick that up and she'll know what to do, because she's got permission to take action based on that early intervention plan.
So permission from you?
Yeah. The earlier you get help, the better.
One of the unrecognised and difficult things to grasp about experiencing schizophrenia is that there's often a cognitive dimension to the whole problem. People have difficulty with organising their thoughts, their memories. They have difficulty with concentration. They have difficulty focusing on events.
The thing with cognitive symptoms is often the professionals don't talk to consumers about those issues. And here you are wondering why you're struggling at work or study, and often it's not because of the psychotic symptoms, it's because of the cognitive impairment which people sometimes experience, and yet it's not talked about, and the professionals don't seem to understand it very much. But I know for myself, I have problems with my memory. They're not major problems, but they're major enough so that I may need things repeated to me differently, and some things I have no recollection of, except for example. And sometimes it affects me in the workplace when I'm learning a new job. That's happened to me in the past. It's taken me a bit longer to learn a job than someone else because of those problems with memory and concentration.
Not everyone has marked or discernible cognitive impairment. However, as a clinician, it's very important for me to understand. It's also very important for the person who's having to live with the illness, find out where their strengths and weaknesses are. That can be done in a practical way, or it can be done with psychological testing. And then you can plan how to deal with issues like how to deal with memory, how to deal with poor concentration, how to deal with focusing problems. And there are simple strategies that will work once the problem's recognised.
What's been helpful for me with concentration is work environments where there isn't too much noise happening. At the moment I work in a building with one other person, and that's good for me. I can handle that situation. I'm a big believer in being organised and planning, and I use a diary religiously, and I write things down in my diary, even things I have to do on the weekends. I write them in my diary, and that's how I remember things. So I'm not relying on memory, and all I've got to do is look in my diary, and that tells me what I have to do. If I've got to ring someone up or whatever, I use that every day.
When I was 22, it was finally like, I can't keep doing this. I have to really make changes in my life because I'm not going to survive unless I work out a way of getting better. There are fundamental things in staying well. Just the basic things like getting enough sleep, because sleep deprivation is like the worst thing for me, I think. You know, a couple of nights without sleep I'd be in hospital. I just, you know. So sleep, getting enough sleep, you know, trying to eat right, trying to do a bit of exercise, not taking drugs. I mean, I'll have a drink occasionally, and I smoke tobacco, but I wouldn't touch any other sort of drugs. I did when I was younger, but I wouldn't now at all. Things like that are just basic, keep your life together sort of things. I can't do as much as maybe the majority of people who get up at 6 every morning and get home at 7. I'm gradually taking on more and more. But I'm in a position where if I can't do something, I don't do it. I sort of put my mental health before most other things. And if I'm getting stressed, then I want to be able to say, well, no, I can't do that. I need to stay at home. I need to rest. And other times when it's like, no, I should do that because I need to get out, because I'm going to get lost in my own, you know, apathy or whatever. And just knowing how much you can take on board, and not taking on too much, but also having enough of a structure to keep you motivated and keep you positive. I started Tai Chi about 2 years ago, and I think more than anything, it's a structure in my life, because I go to 3 classes a week. I have a good teacher, and the people I do it with, they're good people, and I just become so immersed in it that it's just a break from everything else. I mean, it's sort of trying to focus my mind and relax, rather than waking up and sort of like, oh, suddenly like, well, okay, I can go to the graveyard and practice for an hour, or, you know, it's sort of gives me a structure to bounce off, and I think that's important. I mean, exercise is just good for endorphins. Go for a swim, you know. 20 laps, you feel great afterwards.
They say that schizophrenia or madness is irrational and out of control, but in actual fact, there are things that you can do that give you control over those symptoms. You can live a healthier lifestyle to try and avert the symptoms coming on. You know, certainly, you know, good sleeping patterns and good eating habits and good exercise will, to some extent, moderate the symptoms. They might not go away completely, but it will help ease the likelihood that you're going to get sick. I think a lot of the trauma that people go through, particularly when they're first diagnosed, is often they think that their life as they expected it is over. That may not be the case, but it may be the case that they'll have to rethink how they live life for a while. And it can take sometimes some while, some years, before somebody really gets to manage their illness well and is able to do what they want to do with their lives. Often you're forced to reevaluate your life in many ways. One of the ways that for me has been a challenge, I guess, is that there were many times where I couldn't work, and schizophrenia really interfered with my lifestyle, and so I've sort of searched for meaning in my life outside of work to some extent. You know, I work when I can, but there's been other periods where I haven't worked. There's always the options of voluntary work or studying or something like that to fill up your life, but I think ultimately it's valuing who you are as a person. It's the important thing. And when you've got schizophrenia, there's a lot of messages out there in society that you're no good or you're a lesser person, and turning that around can be quite hard for somebody when they're first diagnosed. And I think the reality is that you're somebody with a very disabling illness at times, and you know, a lot of people live their lives very courageously trying to overcome that, and that's not often seen by society. And so I mean, like, realistically assessing the fact that you're living with a disability, and it takes energy and effort to overcome that, and giving yourself credit for that is part of how you restore your self-esteem, I guess. Often people with schizophrenia do get back into the workforce, do get into relationships, do get back into study, but often it's a lengthy process to get back into society as they want to. And so in a way you have to live life around your disability sometimes, and people assume that that's going to be a negative thing, and sometimes there are riches in accepting your illness and living with it that are unexpected. But I think a lot of people with schizophrenia also choose a lifestyle that accommodates the illness. And that may be quite important for some people that find it hard to get back into full-time work, or I mean, like, it's like me. I'm an artist, and I work part-time when I can, but I have a very unconventional life in many ways, but it's actually a good life for my schizophrenia. It keeps me well. You know, my hours are very flexible, so if I do need time out, I can take time away, and it doesn't disrupt my lifestyle too much. So I guess I've adjusted to having schizophrenia.
Leading on from why do I keep doing something that makes me paranoid? Most people I know who use marijuana, they like it because they feel relaxed. Usually when people start getting the paranoid thing, they'll say, oh, that's no good, I'm not going to touch that again. But if you're into the relaxed feeling, you'll risk it.
I started smoking pot when I was about 15, started experimenting with it and was smoking it, I guess, kind of regularly when I was 16, and that's when I was sick. But I didn't make that connection. There's no way I made it. It was years later before I made that connection.
The majority of young people I see who develop a psychosis were smoking marijuana heavily at the onset. Although we know many people use marijuana without necessarily developing psychosis. Once people do start to develop psychotic symptoms, they usually find they have to stop, and even a small amount of marijuana will rapidly bring on psychotic symptoms. Stimulants such as amphetamine and cocaine do induce psychotic symptoms.
These drugs, they play with the chemicals in our brains, and it's like, they do affect different people differently, but if you have a mental illness, or I just know how it affects me, and I know that I don't want my reality to shift. I want to be able to, it shifted when I was younger a lot, and now I want to have a fairly good idea of what's going on, and if I smoked pot, I wouldn't know. I'd become confused, and it would take me a while to work it out again, and I don't want that.
One of the crucial things I think what you can do is let the people that are trying to help you know what you're doing, because if it stays a secret, people think it's something else. They don't. If you're saying, no, I'm not smoking dope, then they'll try and do something else. So it's important to be open and let people know about that.
There's times when you haven't been well, and I know you get sort of the care via the various networks of care that you've got. So it's like, what do I do to add to that?
The mental health system doesn't really work much with families, and so a lot of families have a lot of complaints that they're not involved in the treatment plans and stuff. And I mean, I guess it even happens with me when I've come out of hospital. Sometimes there's not a real lot of thinking goes into who's going to actually care for me and make sure that I'm fed, or literally that I've got food in the house and stuff like that. Because sometimes I can't do that kind of stuff by myself when I'm really sick.
And that's when the emergency package of Tim Tams and...
There are times when sometimes the dynamics of the family become difficult for somebody with schizophrenia, and the person might want to withdraw, or they might find it difficult to interact in ways that they used to. And to recognise that and maybe moderate the lifestyle a bit to accommodate the person, but the person still needs to have guidelines of how to live, and I needed to be told that things weren't acceptable when I was sick.
I'm not going to just tiptoe around you because, oh gee, I might set you off or something. It's just not, I think it's really important that if I disagree with you, I'm going to tell you I disagree with you about things. You're still you, despite the illness. I'm not going to say, oh, you've got an excuse for everything because you've got schizophrenia. That doesn't work. That's rubbish. You're still you.
It's not a matter of pulling yourself together. You can't be told to pull yourself together like a lot of families might try and say to the person with schizophrenia. You're not able to just snap out of it. It takes time, and it takes a lot of work to be able to learn to manage the symptoms and to control what's happening to you. And so families have to understand that, and it's not easy. And I think that's part of the problem, that the energy gets focused on the person that's sick, and family members forget to look after themselves. And sometimes where there's a long-term chronic mental illness, you see family members getting sick or mentally fragile as well out of the stress that's caused. And so they need to find support for themselves, not about what to do about the person, but what to do with their own feelings, that maybe they can't do anything at that point in time to help the person, so then they have to deal with that feeling of helplessness themselves.
If you're really into your art or your poetry or particular ideas, there's times when I think should I be concerned or should I? Is this? It's like that thing. Not everything's a signpost, but I'm always thinking, is that a signpost?
Yeah, but you're not the only one. You know, I mean, that's the problem with if you live with schizophrenia.
Yeah.
You kind of monitor yourself in the same way. So if you get really excited about life and it's just natural excitement, you start to think, oh shit, maybe I'm getting sick again.
Yeah.
When I talk to you, it's like checking my own reality.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you know, I will sort of ask you, have I gone too far? Or I can usually tell when you're really worried because you say, have you checked that out with your psychiatrist?
Do I? Well, that's pretty upfront. When you are getting unwell, you get very, I'm not getting unwell about things. Oh, you can. There's a phase where you go. There's a definite denial phase, and
it's better now than it was though 20 years ago. If you had been trying to talk me out of it 20 years ago, you wouldn't have had a hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas now, you know, part of me is still listening on some level.
Watch for small steps of improvement, you know, because it's a very gradual improvement in the early stages of schizophrenia for a lot of people, and to acknowledge and celebrate any progress that a person makes, whether it's acceptance that they've got the illness, because some people are in denial for a long time, or whether it's somebody's ability to recognise their symptoms and act accordingly to avoid them, or whether it's, you know, some people become very dishevelled and dismissive of their self-care. Maybe they might need encouragement or recognition that they're starting to look after themselves better. And I think also it's hard, but to keep encouraging the person when the person loses hope, to not lose hope with them, to retain a picture of who they were and a vision for who they might become still, but realistic ones in terms of acknowledging that the illness is a hard illness to live with and that it's going to be a struggle to get there.
Whatever you're going through is generally something you're going through, and there is another side. Mm-hmm. Like you do get well again.
Yeah, well, it used to take a long time.
It used to take a long time, but even then, I think we'd still do stuff, and we'd still be brothers and hang out, and whether it's a beer or whether it's
I'd just be dressed in really funny ways.
It's just because you just don't have any style. That's actually nothing to do with your illness. You can't blame that. That's just poor.
Very often the illness comes on when a person's 18 or 19 or younger. And at that stage, a person is trying to individuate from the family and separate from the family and get a life of their own. And often that process becomes really scrambled by the illness, and the rebellion kind of becomes part of the illness and stuff. And you know, very often I see people that are older still trying to separate from their families because they've had schizophrenia and they've never really been allowed the process of separation. I went and lived in a therapeutic community rather than at home. And I think that was one of the best choices I made, not because my family was a bad family, but because sooner or later you have to be independent. And a lot of families prolong that process of becoming independent. And I think that's, again, a message to families to encourage independence at every stage.
Smoking.
I think that the housing thing, you know, the sort of group houses and the interim housing projects were, because I was in an interim housing project with other people who have psychiatric illnesses. They can impart to you things that they know about the system and what's available, some of the things that are available, and that was really important to me, very important to me, because, you know, I wasn't getting that information from my psychiatrist at the time, and I didn't know how to ask or what to ask for, you know, things like that. So having those people there to share their experience, to tell me what was available was really important. I had some stability of housing, of accommodation, which I hadn't had before, because I was always getting kicked out of places, you know, kicked out of everywhere. And I got kicked out of the last place and ended up on the street because I didn't have any money, nothing. You know, I was unemployed, I was on benefits and all this. And anyway, ended up on the street. I was there for a while, and then I ended up in supported housing. B Miles Women's Interim housing for women with psychiatric illnesses was a great place for me to be, because for the first time in a long time I had stability of accommodation, and also I was meeting people who were really good people, and I was getting information, you know, about the mental health system from other people who experience the mental health system, the good things and the things to avoid and the things to, you know, and I was forming friendships with these people. I formed friendships with these people. Eventually, it didn't matter to me that I had been ill, because I'd seen so many other people who were ill and were just fantastic people. Just fantastic people.
I like my life, I like who I am, you know, on a good day. I think if you sort of learn to accept your illness, not fight it, but to fight to be well, but to accept your illness as a part of you that can make you better, you know, as a person maybe. It's one way of looking at it.
On the medication, I do feel I can be me, and I am me, and I quite like who I am. I'm not striving for perfection anymore. I know I still get some symptoms, but I'm not worried about them, and the terror's been taken out, you know, of the symptoms, and I'm pretty free to be me.
I don't see it as the end of the world. Whilst when I've had an episode, those experiences have been very scary and stressful and disruptive to my life. When I'm well, there's a lot of things I can do, and I try and focus on the positives. I think your own attitude towards your illness plays an important part in staying well. Like any other illness, it needs to be managed. You can live with it. I'm okay about it. I would have preferred that I didn't have it, but I've got it. I have to accept that. I'm not the only one in the world with this illness. If you don't manage the illness, you can have relapses and end up in the hospital, but I try and manage it, and I try to stay on top, and I believe for most times I'm successful at doing that.
The hardest thing that I ever do, I think, is talking to an 18-year-old who's just been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Because I go back and I remember how terrifying it was for me, and how frightening and how confusing, and how long it took me to understand what was happening to me. I think the thing that I was looking for initially was some hope that things would get better. And for most people with schizophrenia, things do get better with time, and the symptoms moderate, and people get more control over living with the illness. One of the things that people assume is that because they've got schizophrenia, life is going to be awful. And certainly the symptoms are awful, and it's hard to live with. But you may still have a very rich life in spite of having a disability. Not that I'm the Zen, blissed out, happy, enlightened being, but you know, I think certainly I look at other people that don't have schizophrenia, and you know, there's a lot more people that are unhappier than I am.